Yeah. Okay. If you can't hear me at some point, give me a sign. But yeah, go ahead.
Hello everyone. Sorry, Tim. Hello everyone. We're very sorry for all the delay. We're starting now. It's gonna be a bit different than we planned, but we're gonna be listening to the speakers from this speaker, and in the room we don't have a problem. Thank you again, and sorry.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for your patience, and sorry about the technical difficulties. I hope the rest will be more smooth. My name is Lena Simmet. I'm a senior researcher here at Human Rights Watch in the Economic Justice and Rights Division, alongside my colleagues Sylvain and Sarah, as well as Jack. It's really nice to have you here in our office. And I would just say a couple of maybe welcoming remarks, but I will shorten them since we are starting late, and I would really prefer to listen to the speakers from today. So our session today was co-sponsored by 17 organizations, and is a side event to the IMF and World Bank annual meetings here in DC. And we will be focusing on social protection policies in the Arab region, with a particular focus on the IMF's impact. And so, as we're talking about social protection, I thought maybe to give a couple of clarifications at the beginning, since there's often a lot of questions around what does social protection mean. There's many different terms being used, which then have different implications for policy. So when we talk about universal social security, which is the preferred term for us, we don't talk about universal basic income, which is it's a different concept. It's less rooted in the history of labor rights and human rights generally. But when we speak about universal social security, we refer to programs that are universally structured, such as an example could be a universal child grant, that all children in a certain age range would receive regardless of their income or sort of the assets that the households they live in would have. The same concept applies to social pensions, where all older people above a certain age range would be qualifying for a social pension. Which is why we would prefer the term social security, as it's rooted in the human rights framework, whereas we see social protection having been captured by many development actors, in particular the World Bank and the IMF. Same as the term social safety net, which has also been turned to mean something very narrow. And at the moment, particularly as it's used by the Bretton Woods Institution, refers to very slim, narrow programs that really capture those in sort of extreme poverty. So talking about these misconceptions is therefore important as we engage in policy discussions. And as also we see a change in the approach in many regions. And the MENA region is particularly important as we see discussions around debt, fiscal consolidation, and the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies, often without true investments in universal social protection systems. And one of the arguments we are often confronted with, which is why I'm very excited about today's presentations, is that these countries just don't have the fiscal envelope to invest in truly universal systems. And yet, true to the budget constraints, they have to make do with sort of these slim safety nets. I also wanted to mention that just last week, we, as a collective group of economic justice, human rights, and faith-based organizations published a set of 5 policy briefs that was released by the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, which looked at the impact of IMF and World Bank-backed programs in Argentina, Serbia, Sri Lanka, and South Africa, as well as one brief that looked more generally at the feasibility and affordability of universal programs and systems globally. So we have those briefs can be found on the Global Coalition's website, and we have a couple of sort of handouts too if people are interested. But I wanted to mention it as it's sort of a collective effort of several organizations that have been contributing, and we will continue with this series of policy briefs and are also extending the invitation to other groups who may be interested in contributing briefs moving forward. But now, without further ado, I'm moving to introduce today's panelists. With me in the room is Colin Powers. Colin is a senior fellow and chief editor at the Noria Mina program. He was awarded a PhD from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in 2020 and was a postdoc researcher at Sciences Po Paris in 2022. He's a 2-time recipient of the Fulbright Grant and has over a decade's worth of research experience in the MENA region. He's a political economist by trade and has conducted fieldwork in Palestine, Jordan, Tunisia, and his writings have been published in a number of academic and non-academic outlets. It's great to have you with us. The next speaker will be online, Farah Shami. She's a development economist. She's currently a senior fellow and the social protection program director at the Arab Reform Initiative. She has 8 years of experience working with CSOs, academic institutes, and UN entities on advancing policy reforms in the Arab region. Her areas of expertise include conducting and managing interdisciplinary research, coordinating national and international advocacy efforts, facilitating professional communities, and leading capacity building programs. Welcome, Farah, and sorry you couldn't join us today in person, but very glad that we can still have this conversation today. And then the third panelist will be Hassan Sherry. He's an assistant professor of economics at the Lebanese American University. He holds a PhD in economics from SOAS, University of London, and Master of Science in Development Economics and Policy from the University of Manchester. His professional experience spans both academia and research-based advocacy. Welcome, Hassan. You will be joining us online. And the fourth speaker, Nabil Abdo from Oxfam, unfortunately wasn't able to join us due to other IMF advocacy commitments. So with that, I will hand it over to Colin to kick us off. You have about 10 to 15 minutes.
So with the support of Friedrich Ebert's North Africa office, last year, a year and a half ago, I wrote a report on social insurance systems, contributory systems in Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. So I can just give you a quick background on what I found, and then can have a more in-depth conversation as part of Q&A. All of these systems kind of are to some degree a colonial inheritance. They adopted a Bismarckian employment-tied model of social insurance, which the post-colonial leaders opted for largely because they believed in modernization and industrialization and were convinced that they would end up with full employment relatively swiftly. So it made sense to opt for this rather than a tax finance universal system. Over time, particularly in the lead up to the Arab Spring, these systems ran into significant financial troubles. More consequentially, perhaps, they also had a massive inclusivity problem in that only a very narrow share of workers were actually within these systems. It was public sector kind of foundation, and then a narrow fraction of private sector workers. So in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, with particularly in Egypt's case, a helping hand from the World Bank, the ILO to some degree, reform initiatives were attempted. Morocco's to date looks like it might be more successful, but at the end of the day, Morocco has a problem that a huge portion of their labor force is agricultural, largely informal, and they have, all these countries have super low labor force participation rates. So even if you're successful in enrolling every worker, the fact is it's a pretty small amount of the working age population that is in the labor force in the first instance. But regardless of that, in Egypt's case today, we've still got about 55% of the employed are notionally within the social insurance system, which works out to 28% of the working age population. Some of those people might have spousal access and whatnot, but you can tell that's not a great number. There's also the issue of non-complementarity between social protection and social insurance. So if you're an informal worker and you're deciding, should I start contributing to this system? But what if I lose access to the non-contributory ones? You can imagine what decision you would make in that context. The requirements in terms of like minimal years of contributions to access a pension are fairly high. And I think, given the irregularity of work in the informal sector, that probably is going to end up excluding a lot of people from actually claiming any benefits in the long term. The path they've crafted to financial viability has ultimately implied a massive cut in retirement benefits. So at the time of the law's introduction, an average pension equated to 75% the average wage in Egypt. And by the time the reforms are fully processed, you're looking at that being 30% the average wage. The minimum pension will be a robust 6% of the average wage, which is not of great assistance to anybody. So, yeah, it leaves a lot to be desired. Never mind the fact that in the final instance, you're asking a worker who's making very little to contribute 15% of that very little to a retirement plan. And it's, well, I can't contribute 15% to my retirement plan, so I don't know how those people are supposed to. So yeah, it seems kind of a misguided, if not the worst intended attempt at changing people's conditions. Morocco, like I said, has had a slightly better kind of trajectory, I would say, but the low labor force participation rate kind of draws into question the wisdom of sticking to an employment tied social insurance system in the first and final instance. And the financial health of the Moroccan pension fund, like the Egyptian and like the Tunisian, is ultimately kind of still in trouble because younger folks are not coming into the system at the rates necessary to fund the retirements of the people today, never mind the people tomorrow, right? So the kind of generational gap that exists in all these labor markets in terms of formality and informality is feeding into this financial non-viability of pension systems, and requiring steady transfers from government treasuries. So we're kind of just playing out the same cycle. In Tunisia's case, I should just add, yeah, they're making very little progress with bringing in the self-employed. So that's, those are the people primarily excluded as concerns people within the labor market itself. And you have huge arrears that the pension fund has built up to the public health system. So given Tunisia's existing troubles with paying for imports and pharmaceutical goods and everything else, the fact that the pension funds, due to their financial troubles, owe billions of dinar to the public health system does nothing good for anybody. So I guess then the question is, how did we get here? Why are these troubles so kind of robust and difficult to get past? And what might a better pathway forward look like? The argument I made in the paper is, if you kind of look at the popular foundations of power in each country, and the national growth regimes, you can kind of get a good sense for how we get to this impasse. As for the former, obviously all these governments rely extensively on the security services for ensuring their stability, but in any country context, there always has to be kind of social constituencies which acquiesce or actively support the regime in order for them to stand. And in this case, I'd say there's three main ones. You have that fraction of the working class that was included in these social insurance systems from the start. So public sector workers and a small section of private sector workers. I wouldn't overstate their kind of commitments to keeping the existing models of social insurance. Certainly in Tunisia, the UGTT has fought to expand, coverage, and they are not just looking out for themselves, but there is something based on the fact that they have fought for and retained benefits for their members, and that gives them an incentive to kind of keep the status quo together. More significantly, I think, are two or three, however we want to break it down, categories. The first would be sort of professional middle class in a lot of these countries. The tax systems are arranged so most of these folks are asked to self-file their taxes. Most of them do not do so. And so it's kind of a implicit form of tax code welfareism that the governments have worked out with kind of the urban intelligentsia, where it's like, yeah, don't worry about taxes, and that's sort of a way of, if not currying favor, of kind of sort of legitimating a status quo. More importantly, of course, is both overt and implicit tax code welfareism extended to the business community. So in some of these instances, we're looking at the tax codes and incentives that are given to foreign capital, massive tax holidays, essentially permanently reduced tax rates that have deprived these governments of billions every year. There's also just turning an eye to tax evasion, which is quite common, whether through competence levels of the tax authorities or because of their actively supporting it. But regardless, the outcome is the governments aren't bringing in enough money to actually fund an alternative to employment-based social insurance, right? Because I think Farah will talk about this as well. Like the best path to kind of an equitable system would be with a tax-funded universal kind of guarantee of old age benefits. It's the most socially just way of risk pooling and guaranteeing people a decent quality of life. But you need money to do that. And due to the kind of ways governments have found to satisfy social constituencies that they determine essential to their own power, you're not bringing in those revenues. And then the kind of second major driver of this impasse is that, it's growth, right? And this is not a endogenous phenomenon. It's partially one, but you have to regard the place that all these economies have in the global economy, in global capitalism, and how that affects their abilities to generate growth, to generate jobs, to generate the right kinds of jobs, right? And so, unfortunately, all these economies kind of matured at a time when oversupply issues with manufactured goods were making industrial-led growth really difficult. So when you have all people coming from the countryside to the cities, they don't end up in factories, informal jobs. They end up in informal service trades primarily, right? And so that's kind of structurally this massive issue, right? Because like in this context, it's really hard to deliver high levels of growth and therefore high levels of tax revenue. And it's also hard to kind of have the traditional ways of including workers in social insurance. So, the goal needs to be, in my view, a tax finance universal system. And, as a point of departure, that has to start with debt relief, and with kind of major adjustments to the way the global economy works, the way capital flows across borders works, and then obviously huge changes in sort of domestic power structures. Otherwise, we're going to kind of stay stuck in this cul-de-sac.
Thank you, Colin. Well, I think it's really interesting how you also spoke about the social contract, essentially, between the lack of adequate coverage and also adequacy of benefits, which then makes people less inclined to pay their taxes and pay back into the system. And I think it's, something I would love to get into in our discussion after the other two panelists is sort of this role of contributory and non-contributory systems, right? So you shared quite a bit about the contributory side, and I think Farah will talk about the social assistance side, so the current non-contributory systems, and whether we still see a role for both, right? Because you seem very critical of the contributory side of things. But so for now, Farah, maybe you can share more about the social assistance side. So over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lena. Thank you, everyone. Hello. I hope everyone is doing well. So yes, as Lena said, I'm going to mostly focus on the non-contributory side, but I want to essentially be presenting this new research report that I wrote for the Arab Reform Initiative. It's one of our latest publications that we launched around the annual meetings. As you can see from the table of contents, it's a comprehensive report. It's an extensive report. It taps into all the different dimensions of the issue of financing universal social protection systems in the region and the role of international financial institutions, particularly the World Bank and the IMF on this level. The report is obviously a regional one. It refers, by the way, to a lot of the works that have been done by colleagues, by partner organizations, by many people in the room, by the way, and it builds on their work. It also has got original data collection and data analysis. And here as well, I can add that from a research method point of view, it adopts a mixed method approach. So there is the quantitative and the qualitative coming together, but also an interdisciplinary approach, because we look at the financing question in addition to the technical part and how we can make things feasible from an economic point of view. We look at the political economy of financing social protection in the region, and we look at the socio-political aspect of the matter as well. In doing so, we politicize this technical discussion. And this is what we think is the value added of this report, being on the region and doing this, but also Colin's report politicizes this same sort of discussion. So as you can see, I cannot for sure go through everything, but for the purpose of this meeting, I will particularly focus on contributory schemes, on the public finance and fiscal policies as inherent insufficiencies in government finance schemes, the role of IFIs therein, and also the solutions on this level. But if you want, you can explore the report. It's got a chapter on each and every a channel of the problem, but also it's got a chapter or a section on each and every alternative when it comes to fiscal state strategies that can feed into social spending or that can free up room for social spending. So in the first section, just passing, I want to mention it. It basically, which is titled "Social Protection in the Arab Region: How Competing Priorities and Demands Shape Policies." This is a historical overview about social protection financing in the Arab region, and it shows actually how, as Colin was mentioning, social protection started first as a tool for authoritarian bargains, for political bargains, and for crony capitalist outsourcing, and it was meant essentially to offset a political system deficit, to be a tool of political compliance, and to increase the political regime's constituent basis indeed. And with time, how this evolved. So this section, it shows how this evolved with time, how it was possible to use social protection as a political bargain tool because of the oil and gas, because of the pivotal role of the Arab region when it comes to trade with the Suez Canal, with the remittances from migrant workers, because of politically driven aid and so on and so forth, and how this evolved until we basically reached this figure. This figure, we can basically conclude this figure from so many sources of data, but we did our own mapping of social protection reforms, programs, policies, interventions in 12 Arab countries from 2010 till 2023. So since the Arab uprisings, and this is basically how, after social protection, the social protection landscape evolved, we reached this figure basically because it was not possible to finance social protection anymore based on or domestically or through an internal redistribution of wealth and public resources. And with time, first of all, from a public point of view, the population started to reject this basically contract or this model. The government started to realize that it is not possible to sustain it anymore. But at the same time, and as a result, this led to a great reliance on foreign aid, especially in the form of debt. And this is when, in the period of Infitah and the Bretton Woods institutions and the rise of neoliberalism that coincided with the period of Infitah, that Arab countries shifted their models from, or basically shifted that to one that is more of a poverty alleviation model. And we got much less non-contributory schemes than contributory. Now, even on the contributory, as Colin said, we're not doing well. We're not doing well enough because of the contributory base that is very tight. We tap into that in the report. The barriers to contributory schemes are many. Colin mentioned many of them, and we overlap on many. The insufficient political will, because now the Arab governments have found different ways to practice clientelism and sectarianism and crony capitalism and other forms of survival strategies, to the institutional fragmentation that we suffer from, especially on the level of social protection systems, and the lack of public trust. So this has shrunk the contribution base for sure. But despite that, non-contributory systems remain much less than a contributory system. Why is it so? Because contributory systems are government financed. So they're not contribution financed, they're not self-financed. And being government financed, most of the public resources that are supposed to, or the majority of the public resources that should finance them are taxes. Naturally, they are mainly tax financed. That's why we call them tax financed. Now, in the report, we do a mapping of all IMF programs, loan agreements, with not including any staff level agreements, of course. All IMF agreements with Arab countries, and at the same time. So, if we look at the graph that is on the right, so this is by Isabel Ortiz and her colleagues. We explain what is it that entails, or what are what is the conditionality and the repercussions, and what is it that accompanies basically IMF loan agreements. With IMF loan agreements, in addition to debt and all like the impact of debt, the indebtedness, and the whole debt trap. In addition to that, we have a wide set of conditionality of all sorts. I'll let my colleague Hassan talk about this. But especially we have austerity measures being imposed of all kinds as well. And there is also like this overall neoliberal approach, which combines with austerity all sorts of liberalization policies, trade liberalization, labor market liberalization, and financial or liberalization or monetary liberalization. So here in Isabel Ortiz et al.'s graph, we see that or what loan agreements entail. They entail recommendations such as improving the targeting of social safety nets and further investing in safety nets, reducing non-priority expenditures, reducing subsidies, some pension reforms, particularly privatizing social security and pension systems, reducing employers' contributions for sure, wage bill caps or cuts in public wage bills, and other labor market flexibilization. Now, if we go to this one, so we only focused on 2020 when it comes to scanning IMF reports. And we can see that in 2020 was a crisis year for the world and the region. In 2020, we had the 5.2 billion SBA in Egypt, the 1.3 FF in Jordan, and the 0.7 RFI in Tunisia. And we can see that indeed, not only in the global south, as the previous graph was showing, but also in the Arab region, just in 1 year when agreements were made, for the agreements just that were made in 2020, there was a reduction in reallocation of public expenditures, of the typical austerity, and of course, reduction in subsidies, public wage bills, tax reforms that are for sure, I will delve more deeply into that in a bit, and more safety net targeting. So all of this, what is it doing? And also my colleague Hassan will talk about debt and how debt is also consuming, causing public budget deficits and fiscal imbalances. But what is this doing? It is essentially shrinking the fiscal space that is available for social spending. And given the political economy of the issue and given the priorities of our governments, when public expenditures are being reduced, what is being reduced the most is social spending and social protection spending. And in these figures, so when this graph was made, it preceded ILO's latest World Social Protection Report, but the data I'm sure wouldn't have improved much anyway. So you can see how much we spend on social protection compared to the world. It's like very mediocre spending on health as well. And at the same time, if we compare social spending to or spending on social protection and spending on health to military spending in all countries, we can see that military spending competes with health spending, and this is quite worrisome. So this graph also shows this, and now I'll show you a lot of these graphs. I mean that we included. I just like collated them in one document. But in this graph, we take. I'm sure you saw like this table, which has all the IMF interventions significant. Like this is not also withstanding all concessions and soft loans, the SDRs, and everything that has got also that entails major repercussions. But we take the loans as cutoff points, and we see the trends. Of course, there are fluctuations. There are overall downward trends, and there are trends that are kind of stationary or like steady across time, but fluctuations that are seen right after or soon after an intervention. So we see a decrease in social spending and in public spending, particularly in Lebanon. Of course, everything is. So there are crises, internal crises, but there are also recommendations by international financial institutions coming into play. In Egypt, particularly, I'm sure you can see that after 2016, both the public spending in general, speaking about consumption spending, but also the social spending in Tunisia and Morocco. So adding to that, additional figures. So I'm just showing you how the report tries to collate different research, one that we collect and others that and other kind of research and analysis that other organizations and experts have collected. We can see in 3 of the target countries, which are 5, by the way. We focused on Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Lebanon, and Jordan. We can see that we pay on debt servicing in the region more than on health. So expenses on debt servicing are higher than expenditures on health. And these basically, when I was speaking about the deregulation in general, the market deregulations of all sorts, so we also saw in these trends with the cutoff points being the loan dates, basically how IMF is hampering the economy. And this is directly related. We cannot consider it not directly related to social spending, because when it comes to unemployment, to economic growth, to the public budget deficit and all these indicators, all of these basically affect the GDP, which is a proxy to government expenditures, unfortunately. What is happening by austerity? We're reducing subsidies because we say that instead we're going to offset that by increasing the level of cash transfers. But studies have shown that this is not the case, including the study by Oussama Diab on Egypt and Tunisia for FES. Also, the World Bank programs are basically, so there is this coordination, as you know, between the World Bank and the IMF. And in order to offset the impact of austerity that is recommended by the IMF, the World Bank in general, or more generally, is increasing its poverty-targeted social, the support of poverty-targeted social safety nets. For example, if I am to give a couple of figures from the paper, so Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia pay a sum of $22 billion per year as surcharges. But at the same time, in Egypt alone, spending on energy subsidies has decreased from about 40% of total expenditures in 2017, which is right after the 2016 loan, to below 30% in 2019. Now, to focus more on the taxation part. So what I wanted to say in the first chunk of my presentation is that everything is related, and then the fiscal space is one, and that all these compounded policies basically are doing harm to the fiscal space, and given government priorities are doing harm to social spending and social protection spending. But especially what is being impacted, and which was also explicitly stated in IMF recommendations in all the previous figures, is basically tax reforms that are regressive because they feed into the neoliberal system, into cronism, into corporatism. So we have a small tax base in the region because of the large size of the informal sector, for sure, because of the exclusion of migrants and refugees due to political red lines that we all know. That is a second reason, because of tax evasion, of tax avoidance, because of unnecessary and unfair tax deductions, exemptions, incentives, and credits when they exist. And at the same time, and I think also my colleague Colin mentioned that, we have self-exclusion, a problem of self-exclusion, because the social contracts are broken. I'm going to speak about tax collection first. Governments do not want to collect taxes because they do not want to provide services through government systems. They want their political parties and faith-based organizations to be providing. So in the tax collection and administration, we have a major gap. But at the same time, even the citizens do not see themselves as citizens because for them, no rights, no taxation, no representation, no taxation. So even citizens do not trust public systems and do not want to practice this form of citizenship in paying taxes because they do not believe that they would get anything in return. So obviously here, this is the distribution of basically the forms of taxes in the Arab region. This is by ESQA, and we can see that goods and services are occupying the space. Revenues from direct taxes are little data there is on that, but also we can see that indirect taxes are taking a major chunk of that, but also the direct taxes, this doesn't mean that they are progressive enough. If I go to one of the other graphs that we use or that we put, it's obvious that the average effective tax rate in 14 Arab countries is less than the world's average. And in most cases, it's less than the statutory CIT or corporate income tax due to corporatism and tax dodging for sure. And here, to be more exact and to provide data that we use in the paper, in Jordan, companies in the industrial sector pay a preferential rate of 14% as compared to the minimum corporate tax rate of 35%. Other sectors, including the financial and mining sectors, pay 24%. Whereas many other activities, particularly in the services industry and amongst the self-employed professionals, they pay only 20%. So this is as compared to 35%. In Tunisia, for example, corporate income tax has witnessed two major decreases in the past. The first is in 2014, back to the first table, when it dropped from 30 to 25%. And the second in 2020, during COVID, when it dropped from 25 to 15 which is an all-time low. And this is when also there was an IMF intervention coinciding with COVID, the pandemic. In Egypt, between 2014 and 2018, the share of total taxes on goods and services increased from 42.8% to 48%, while the share of corporate income taxes decreased from 35.9% to 24%. And overall, income tax in the region yields less than 2% of GDP, while it accounts for 8.31% in OECD countries. So this is a worrisome situation, and there is no political will to change that, basically. That we also suffer, so in addition to issues in tax collection and administration, we suffer from illicit financial flows, from all forms of corruption, leakages, misappropriations, embezzlements. And our tax systems, as I said, are regressive. So in addition to the tax base being tight, we have a few brackets. Tax brackets are regressive essentially because they are nominal. And that is because we do not look at total income. We look at salaries. So basically, the social group that is most affected by taxes are salaried employees, and this is why there is tax evasion, and this is why tax collection is also less than expected. And for example, in many countries of the West, they look at the family income, and they look at all the family as one unit because they look at total income, which is a proxy for wealth. There is also okay, so I'm gonna now start talking about the alternatives. Now, like I could delve deeply kind of into this part, which is public finance and the fiscal system. The report delves into other parts, into the role of climate finance as things are now, into the role of debt, and into as I said, the contributory part and other parts of the issue. The same when it comes to alternatives. We give alternatives for every one of these components of the report, but when it comes to fiscal reforms, 5% wealth tax, according to Oxfam, on the most fortunate, whose incomes are $5 million and above, would lead a total revenue of $10 billion. This can really save the fiscal space. There is also now a leverage point, which is the UN Tax Convention, which passed earlier this year, which provides a fertile space for the implementation of two things: of the 2% global wealth tax that we've been asking about for long, and of the 15% global minimum tax on corporations and billionaires. If we are to think of more internal alternatives, we need to reduce VAT. That is to begin with. And if we are to use indirect taxes, there are indirect taxes that are less harmful and that are a bit more progressive or relatively better. Now, we know that not everything is feasible as things are in all contexts, because, for example, how can we ask for a sales tax in a cash economy or an economy where we do not have a financial system, a digitalized financial system, or a digital economy in general? But slowly but surely, and in the recommendations part, we split the recommendations into short-term and long-term reforms, increasing for sure the progressivity of personal income taxes and corporate income taxes by increasing the number of brackets and making sure this is adjusted to inflation, because the paper again speaks about the context specificities, and in many instances not adjusting tax revenues to inflation was a major part of why the pure loss in public systems is what we are currently struggling with. When it comes to wealth taxes, we propose capital taxes, capital gain taxes, property taxes of all sorts, real estate gain, real estate vacancy, Robinhood taxes for the financial markets. We give examples from international experiences. So this is compared to the research that is usually done on the region. This is what also is one of the added values of this paper, that it looks at international experiences. We don't try to project these on the region because it's got its context specificity, but we try as much as possible to prove or demonstrate that there is hope, conditional or contingent on some reforms taking place before. But in Argentina and Spain and Iceland, these wealth taxes were used and helped increase the fiscal space. There is the mono tax that we talk about a lot, which happened in Uruguay, in Brazil, and in Argentina. which is a single payment that combines contribution and taxation to include the self-employed workers in micro enterprises and other formal workers that we could do, and that could happen a bit relatively faster because it doesn't require lots of preparations and a major technical infrastructure. Export taxes in Latin America have proven to be a good solution, and in many cases they were earmarked to fund the introduction of specific universal social protection schemes. Sin taxes, digital services taxes, remittances taxes, like in Colombia and Georgia. We also, for example, talk about taxing negative externalities, especially the extraction of natural resources, such as in Bolivia, Mongolia, and Zambia. Basically, options are many, and we also refer to the study that has been done by Development Pathways and Act Church of Sweden, where they prove that more than 52 countries of the Global South could basically introduce universal social protection schemes that amount for more than 88 programs, basically. And 52 countries of the Global South make 39% of the countries. So this is a proof that what we are proposing is possible. I just included, this is one of the many figures that exist in the report, but I just included it because it has like bits and pieces of everything. And it's also by our very dear Isabel Ortiz. Those are fiscal space strategies that have been done by many countries of the South before, and that we can learn from. And in the report, we basically take them one by one and see what is feasible where, and we analyze it. I'm sorry, I know that I took way longer than I should have, but I just wanted somewhat to do justice to the report, at least to the part of it that I could present. And I hope, yeah, you enjoyed listening despite being too long. Thank you very much. We cannot hear you, by the way, in case you've started speaking. We cannot hear you.
Okay, I think we're back.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No.
And Farah, we heard your entire excellent presentation. Thank you for giving a really great overview of all the different opportunities to increase the fiscal space. I think some of the data and graphs that you showed are really striking, especially sort of comparing the different tax revenues across countries. There's some really interesting data to drill deeper. But now I would like to hand it over directly to Hassan, who I think will speak more about the opportunities around debt relief, as well as the impacts of IMF conditionalities. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lena, Farah, Colin, the organizers. I'm happy to see some of the friendly faces in the room. I'm hoping that the organizers can share my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, thank you. Right, so my presentation is not specifically on social protection schemes. It tries to forge a link between the conversation on social protection and the conversation on debt in the Arab region and in the Global South more broadly. Now, there is an economic and social reality in the Arab region, particularly amongst non-oil exporting Arab countries. And this reality is characterized by a significant increase in debt stocks, but also in debt servicing. Now, the problem is not with debt per se. Debt can be good. But the main problem is that the rising debt stocks and debt service, they often come at the expense of spending on public goods such as education, health coverage, and other requirements for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So let me give some context to why debt is a serious challenge to Arab countries, but also to the global South. Can we move to the second slide, please? Now, developing countries today, they face a significant financing gap in achieving the SDGs. So this gap has grown from around $2.5 trillion in 2014 to about $4.3 trillion today, according to the 2023 World Investment Report. In the region, things are not very different. So there's also a large financing gap, but the only thing is that debt stocks and debt servicing expenditures have grown steadily over the past decades. Can we move to the next slide? Because I want to show you some statistics. Now, this figure shows the one indicator of public debt. This is public debt to GDP ratio, which is the most widely used indicator to gauge the seriousness of debt. Now, this is a scattered plot of different countries in the region, the non-oil exporting, non-GCC countries. This red line, red scattered line, a dashed line in the middle, shows the average. It's the average or the debt to GDP ratio. And it shows that this is the average for the Arab world. The debt to GDP ratio for the Arab world is above that of developing countries and above that of least developed countries in the world. This is about 70% on average in those non-oil exporting countries. Now, middle-income countries in the region, like Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunis, they account for over half of the region's sovereign debt. The Arab least developed countries like Comoros, Djibouti, Mauritania, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen, these guys face heightened risks of default, of insolvency, which means that they can at any time default on their debt. Let's move to the other slide, please. Right. Now, I'm not going to dwell more on this, but this is to show the external public debt to GDP ratio in the region. Now, for public debt to GDP, which includes both domestic and external debt, the average for the region is very high. But when we look at external public debt, and that is debt owed to foreign countries or foreign private entities or foreign multilateral institutions, it happens that the average for the Arab region is highest amongst all other regions from any development status. Developed countries, developing countries, LDCs. Right. And this shows the severity of the debt situation. Let's move one more, please. Okay. Now, compounded to that level of debt stock is the debt service, right? So if we look at public debt interest payments as a share of revenues, budget revenues, we see that over the past decade, there has been an increasing trend, a steady increasing trend in debt servicing as a share of revenues. In countries like Egypt and Lebanon, the debt interest payments as a share of revenues rose to almost 50%. Now, civil society in the region, they cite serious concerns about the sustainability of these fiscal conditions. Effectively, this is some sort of a contraction of the fiscal space, which can largely undermine the capacity of Arab states to allocate resources towards investing in addressing climate change, meeting the SDGs, let alone achieving or contributing to social protection. If we talk a bit about some of the aspects of social protection, take, for instance, health, because I believe Farah covered something about education. So if you talk about health, in the region, the health spending is lower on average than all developing countries combined. So the regional average is lower than that for developing countries. Furthermore, it's not just about spending. It's also about looking at growth and real GDP growth. The region has been experiencing significant stagnation. Stagnation is another word for a slowdown in economic activity or a recession. Real GDP growth between 2022 and 2023 have decreased from 5.5% to 1.3%, according to the IMF Regional Economic Outlook. Now, this brings us to the role of IFI lending, international financial institutions, particularly the IMF, which is a dominant player in the region, especially after the 2011 uprisings. So the question is, has IMF lending supported or hindered the achievement of development goals in the region? Can we move forward, please? Right. So the prevailing belief among Arab civil society organizations is that IMF programs have generally failed to stimulate development, particularly when those programs and these lending arrangements are accompanied by austerity measures, as evidence suggests. So let's take a closer look at the breakdown of IMF conditionality by policy area. This includes 10 Arab countries, non-GCC countries, and we're trying to look at all lending arrangements that took place between 1990 and 2020 with the IMF. I'm not interested in the size of these lending arrangements. I'm interested in the number of conditions. And these conditions can be broken down into two types. One is soft conditions, and the others are hard conditions. Now, I'm interested more in hard conditions, which are also called binding conditions. Now, binding conditions means that any failure by the state to meet these conditions could result in the suspension of further loan disbursements or tranches. So if you look at the number of hard conditions over these years, we can notice that in these Arab countries, we've had around 1,224 conditions, which constitute about 60% of total conditions. Right. Now, what is relevant about these conditions is the following. That if we want to look at where these conditions were distributed, we can notice that fiscal, monetary, and external issues, so we're talking about revenue and tax issues, austerity, in other words, interest rates, and trade and exchange rates, these accounted for the majority of IMF program conditions, most of which were binding, by the way. Now, this reflects a clear adherence, as Farah said, to austerity. And this suggests that the IMF has not really distanced itself from the long-standing reputation of prioritizing macroeconomic stability over social protection or meeting the SDGs. Right. Now, of course, there are context-specific political economy factors for why there's a debt buildup, not only external factors. So, for instance, we know that external factors are very important, like, for instance, the fact that the fiscal and external balances in the region are highly sensitive to external shocks, like the 2008 World Food Crisis, like the 2020 COVID-19 crisis, the 2022 Russia-Ukraine war, the 2023-24 Israel-Palestine and Israel-Lebanon wars. So these significantly contribute or impact the fiscal and external balances and contribute to the debt buildup. Right. But on the internal level, public spending can contribute to the erosion of the primary balance, and thus it can contribute to the buildup of debt. But here we need to make a distinction. So we have to distinguish between beneficial spending and between harmful spending. So when we talk about beneficial spending, this can include public investment, this can include social protection, which really raises the quality of citizens' lives in the region. Of course, this is very different than spending that is driven by corruption, by domestic power relations, by poor governance, and what have you. And it is very important that this distinction be made in the framework of IMF lending, contrary to flat austerity. It's not only about balancing the books, it's also about balancing the books, but also preserving lives. So what should be done in this case? If we can move to the last slide, please. Right, so if we agree, or if the idea is shared that social protection and the SDGs should be incorporated within the debt management frameworks and the IMF lending frameworks, then this may require more than just financing to these countries to help them or to prevent, running into default. It's not just about that. It's not only about servicing the debt from as a financial obligation from a narrow economic myopic lens. This is because if we assume that today the IMF or multilateral institutions, they would give or inject liquidity to poor economies, maybe they can help them postpone default or being insolvent. But this does not necessarily mean that they are going to help them default on the SDG, not default on the SDGs, or not default on social protection, or not default on climate mitigation. These are two separate issues. And ultimately, addressing these debt challenges in the region, the debt buildup, the debt servicing levels, should have aims beyond just financing or preventing a default. So addressing these challenges, the contraction of fiscal space, as Farah suggested earlier, they do require a rights-based debt management approach coupled with great international support, affordable lending, concessional lending, and collaborative efforts from all stakeholders. The IMF and the World Bank, when they want to gauge or they want to comprehend to what extent is the debt challenge serious in these countries, they have something called the Debt Sustainability Assessment. Now, these DSAs, Debt Sustainability Assessment, they don't take into account the requirement to meet the SDGs. They take into account certain macroeconomic variables to make sure that there's fiscal consolidation, that the books balance. But the idea is that we cannot continue with this business as usual approach. There needs to be a different logic. Debt sustainability assessments must link debt relief, debt restructuring, navigating debt challenges to the requirement of achieving SDGs, achieving climate mitigation, spending on social protection schemes, etc. But that is not all. There's also something that lies on the responsibility of international financial institutions and domestic governments alike. And that is that any development finance, whether it's external financing, injections of liquidity, or domestic resource mobilization through tax generation, it has to focus on addressing the underlying causes that lead to a lack of liquidity and lead to the debt buildup in the first place. So here we're talking about structures of the economic structures of Arab economies, like many other global South economies, really. So this involves strengthening domestic industries, for instance, right, to reduce reliance on export, to reduce the propensity to import, and to diversify the export base in order to decrease dependency on commodity exports, because many of the global South countries, many of the Arab countries rely on commodity exports for foreign currency. Right. And one more issue that there's something that recently there's been talks on on some kind of a more inclusive, more development-oriented debt architecture. And global CSOs have already called for the initiation of what is known as an intergovernmental process to establish a UN framework convention on sovereign debt, something along the lines of the UN Framework Convention on Tax. This will help resolve unsustainable debt burdens, including through debt relief and debt restructuring regulation. We hope that this initiative comes to fruition. So I will stop here, but I don't want to take much more time, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Hassan, for sharing a little bit more about looking also into the details of debt and and that not necessarily all of it is always harmful, but we need to understand really what drives it and its composition. With that, I would like to open it up for the Q&A part of the session. So if anyone either in the room or online has questions, please either paste them in the chat, or I don't know if you can raise your virtual hand, or anyone here in the room. Please go ahead. Salma? Yeah.
Fine, you all hear me?
If you can't hear in the room.
We can hear
Okay.
you, Salma.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much for a very rich session and a lot of information and recommendations to think about. I have a little bit of a comment slash question for Colin, especially. When we're talking about social security system, first we keep in mind that we're talking about employers, firm owners, corporates that are contributing into the well-being of the rest of the population. So it's like a soft redistribution, very primary, and they're not doing so. So in Egypt, for instance, and all the Arab countries, we have the same portrait that they have a very young population. And the reason why these funds are in deficit is that employers don't pay their shares. So they don't have formal jobs, they don't pay their shares. And even if they have formal jobs, they have this way of paying way less than they should. And this maybe that leads to my second thing. I'm thinking here. I'm not like making judgments, but in order to have taxes, we need democracy. We need a lot of trust in governance, which we don't have. So basically, here this may give us like we need to think more of social security funds before taxes. We cannot depend only on taxes. And basically, actually, I don't prefer to make this dichotomy. Should it be contributory? Should it be tax-based? I think, yeah, looking at the world in the mid-60s and 50s, it was always a mix of both, because everyone hedges against other different kinds of risks and gives a layer of protection to different kinds of population. So yeah, I think we maybe should think a lot about that. Wow, 28 agreements in the region after the Arab Spring, 28 IMF agreements. It's like the IMF Spring, not so yeah.
It was spring.
Yes.
It was.
I think I'll just stop here.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that always strikes me with the IMF and I mean in general at this point of kind of international relations, international economics, there's a fundamental ignorance or refusal to engage with the fact that one country's exports imply another country's imports. One country's credit implies one country's debt. And so they moralize and politicize. Look at the Germans, for instance, right? They treat the Italians or the Greeks as being somehow reckless for borrowing, but they're often borrowing to buy German cars, without which Germans' industry, their industry would decline. And so there's just all of the solutions to these issues. It's not to say there's not profound governance issues within the Middle East itself. But resolution requires kind of a global perspective, right? And with climate issues coming a million miles an hour, the choice is ultimately, does Europe want to treat that as a migration crisis, which leads to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, dying in the Mediterranean, Or would you rather say, you know, how do we make the amount of capital available that is required to kind of steady these societies against what is coming, what is here already? You know, and so I think that that's where the IMF, World Bank, all these people that are meant to be adopting not the creditor's hand, you know, they're ensuring liquidity so that debt repayments continue, not that these economies grow or stabilize. That's not really the agenda, and it hasn't ever been. But that's a fundamental mistake, right? Because without getting there, you just require another emergency injection of capital to keep everything turning over. And so I think there's this myopia on the part of the international institutions and organizations that are meant to have a global perspective. And that leads us into a really dangerous place. And the only other thing I would add, the kind of democracy deficit you bring up is huge, obviously, and but there's also a deficit of profitability in a lot of ways. You know, a lot of the firms that are shirking on their employees, and they are, obviously, but they kind of run businesses that are at the margins. You know what I mean? It's like a lot of the informal sector, the service sector, some make big money, but a lot of the nature of these businesses isn't to have, you know, huge inflows. And so that kind of makes like staying in business contingent on minimizing labor costs to the degree that, you barely pay anything to your worker, and you certainly don't contribute to the insurance schemes, you know. And so there needs to be a way of kind of addressing the larger growth model. Otherwise, it just everything becomes so tenuous, you know. And so I think it makes this like you can get narrow and into the weeds of the policies themselves and different kind of institutional fixes, but if you end up neglecting the underlying kind of major structural drivers of trouble, of de-development, of all, you know, if you're not addressing that, then you're really putting a band-aid on a wound that is going to bleed right through it ultimately.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Maybe we can take a couple at a time and then have a last round of comments from the panelists, since I think after that we have to close out. Please go ahead.
Good morning, all, and thank you, Colin, Farah, and Hassan for excellent presentations. I don't want to discuss or debate with them regarding to the content. You are close to each other, and always we are working for many years. But this financial and social analysis for what's happening in the region, take into consideration we are in a normal region. Farah and Hassan couldn't come to Washington to participate in these events because they couldn't leave. Why? Because there is Israeli aggression supported by big powers all over the world. They are destroying all aspects of sustainable development. They are destroying and attacking the right of life, not just social protection, talking about the debt. After 2 hours, we have another session at the IMF talking about the debt tax, climate. What we have now in climate, how can we talk about the climate change and its impact on the living conditions of people in the region? I think we should make, and this is my recommendation for Hassan and Farah, and for us also, sons and daughters of the Eastern countries. We should make some change in our methodologies in the future to take into consideration this turbulence circumstances. What's happening in Palestine under occupation now is disaster. They are destroying everything. In Lebanon, the same. In Jordan, a country, we are waiting our lane. What will happen after Lebanon? And every day, the Israeli minister talking about the next step is Jordan, because they would like to transfer Palestinians from West Bank. This is the question. I think when we are talking about these excellent issues, social protection, debt, climate, blah, 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 fiscal policies, role of IMF, World Bank, or IFIs, At this time, we should take into consideration the new, it's not new, but it's escalating now, into consideration when we are analyzing and this is very important to change our priorities. Our priority is now to stop killing people. Our priority is now to say no for Israeli colonialism state. It's colonialism state. This is my opinion. My origin from Palestine. My family left Palestine in 1948 because there is ethnically cleansing happening on that, and the Western big countries, in post-colonialism era, established a colonialism state on the price of the indigenous people. And this is what happened. Thank you, Farah. Thank you, Hassan. And thank you, Colin, for this deep analysis. But we should take into consideration the most influential factors impacting on all of what we are talking about. Thank
you. I had this idea along the annual meetings, and I was thinking that no one did mention that.
Interpreters are asking, interpreters are asking that the person asking the question, if they can be close to the laptop so that they can.
Sure. I will
interrupt again.
مرحبا فرح. So and also now we are talking about alternatives and climate or sustainable solutions, sustainable policies, and we have countries who are financing the war, who are supposed to be the champions of green policies, like Germany, and I'm working for German foundation. That we need to be careful, and we need to think, like, again, with intersectional approach to everything. Like I attended a meeting for big shift, and they were thinking of a campaign, how they will champion countries who are doing good steps regarding clean policies, and they were thinking of championing Germany, and we see now the head of Germany. They are proud of financing the war with the money of the taxpayers in Germany, and also without talking about the impact of this. So going back to social protection, I was thinking that we started talking about social protection when the conditionality started of replacing universal social protection or universal subsidies by cash transfers, and then the reforms happened. But I think what we need to look at now, the implementation. And I was working on the implementation of the Amen Social program in Tunisia, and I saw that it's perpetuating inequalities even within the poorest quintile. I think the next steps, maybe we should also follow or assess how they are implementing this, and how we can try to reduce inequalities coming from this.
Any other questions in the room?
I'm very excited to read. I've learned a lot from today's meeting, but building from that implementation and the next steps, and hearing from the loss of trust and needing the collaboration of the civil society community, but also the leadership of the power. All these amazing solutions, and I've seen it as a trend at these meetings, is that knowledge sharing and that communication. And whether or not, I guess this is a question, is that in all the organizations you work for, is that something that you explore in terms of educating, I guess, local on whether or not, I don't know all the details, but where your tax is going to, or who are you feeding to, building that trust again, but also, I guess, knowledge sharing to the governments. And I guess, is that the IMF's role to advise on X, Y, Z, but I guess maybe some more clarity on that, because I feel like not enough discussion is on that and on the reality of implementation, on how it's seen to build trust on both sides. Yeah.
Anyone else would like to ask a question?
Me back.
We are back. I think there's one question in the chat about Lebanon's national strategy on social protection. So if there's any information about that. So perhaps we can have a round of closing comments from each of the panelists. And then we will close today's session. So perhaps we reverse the order. Hassan, would you like to go first?
Okay, sure. The only thing that I would like to add is that any effective solution to the evolving debt crises, whether in the region or more broadly in the global south, these must involve a shared responsibility. And when we say shared responsibility, we mean there is a responsibility for creditors and debtors alike. And I think that the IMF has a crucial role to play in this area to reinforce the principle of shared responsibility. Because I think if it's not about this, probably there would be no room for solving the unsustainable debt landscape in the region or more broadly in the global south.
Thank you. Farah, would you like to go next?
Yes, thanks, Lena. Okay, many interesting reflections actually and questions. I agree with Ahmad, Mr. Ahmad Awad. Actually, so if we are to be like very raw, like these publications, or speaking about my own, at least it went into the publications pipeline before all of this happened. But also, and basically, we know that it is not the most relevant now. We do know that, we do understand that. But at the same time, this is analysis that we need to do, and these are facts and data that we need to document for now or for later, because the issue of the impact of international financial institutions is an all-time relevant. Once the war is over, we're going to have to come back to that. And even amid the war, if the war is going to stay and expand for long, then we also need to not to be fully consumed by the reactive kind of analysis, and to keep for ourselves the knowledge and the mental, the headspace to be able to discuss these root causes or underlying issues that will affect us, whether during wars or not. That is in my opinion. So it's important, for example, to have a document somewhere, even if we don't use it now, that says, which is like in the case of my report, that 50 countries since the 1990s have done debt swaps and conversions for the purpose of social spending. 60 done negotiated debt for the purpose of social spending. 20 countries defaulted, and 2 countries repudiated debt to as a fiscal space strategy. These kinds of analysis, we want them. On the climate part, so I think Iman's question is important for many reasons. And I want to assure you, Iman, that so at least so of course, like now in my presentation, I had to be selective, but I did a bad job, obviously. But in the report, it was we didn't look at the different tunnels in silos. Like when we analyzed things, it was there was like this overlap between the different parameters of the issue was taken into consideration, and I fully agree with you because, for instance, in the report we showed that wealthy nations have loaned, like literally loaned, at least 18 billion US dollars at market interest rate to fight the effect of climate change in the region. Egypt got $2.1 billion of these, Tunisia got $1.5 billion of these, and Iraq got 1.1. So only these three Arab countries. And in addition to that being a loan and to being at interest rate, at market interest rate, in addition to that, there were conditions accompanying these loans to contract companies in the lending countries, which made basically the funds being funneled back to the West. Like only for in Japan, $10.8 billion went back to Japan because of this basically trick, I'm gonna call it, and $3 billion went back to the US, were funneled back to the US. So what you are saying is very legitimate. The World Bank has a lot to do with that because it sees climate finance as climate projects, and the IMF as a fund has a lot to do with that because it can play the role of a facilitator. The West owes the global South, or countries of the global North owe the global South debt that they should pay for free in forms of grants, not in form of loans, and not in form of projects, and without such conditions being malicious conditions being put into place. Actually, I just want to add two things. There was a question about the trust in public systems and basically the importance of the open government, knowledge sharing, etc. I could not get to this part, but really because I felt like the recommendations was kind of implicitly presented through the analysis that I offered. But yes, in the analysis, but also in the recommendations that ensue from the analysis, we give very tangible recommendations to the governments, a set to the governments, a set to the IFIs. And the set to the governments, there are short-term to medium-term recommendations, and in the other and long-term recommendations, and for the IFIs as well. And we tap into these things very clearly as to how can we build the trust slowly but surely, how we can start providing services before imposing new taxes with whatever resources we have, so that the trust is built, so that people do not self-exclude. The same when it comes to knowledge sharing and its importance and all of these. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. The National Social Protection Strategy in Lebanon, things have been on hold since February, unfortunately. There is a big gap. I always talk about that with colleagues, with Lena. There is a big gap in our countries because of political reasons between the legal and the legislative and then the executive. And we are now facing this gap. When it comes to the pension reforms, they are also on hold since December, but this was expected because in the reforms, this was the plan. The plan was for that to be implemented or to start being implemented early in 2025. For the strategy, it should have started getting implemented, but they're holding it. As you know, we all know them. Every time they give a reason. One time it is basically the war, one other time it's something else. And yes, that's it. I think I addressed all questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Colin, over to you.
Yeah, I guess in closing, I think it's both like the scale of the issues and the nature of the issues that are impacting the region socioeconomically, developmentally, politically, are almost never engaged. On scale, the World Bank was pushing billions to trillions a couple of years ago about how they were going to use their capital to de-risk private inflows, and that was going to somehow save the world. And then you look at what they deliver, and it's like peanuts, like truly peanuts. And as Farah said, a lot of that money gets rerouted back to an American corporation or a German high-speed train line. It's just nonsense. But the scale of it is also so small. There was a time in history where 25% of GDP might have been spent on building a health network, or building public housing, and now 1% GDP blows people away as a huge amount of money. And it shows a lack of intent. And I think I think there's also like fundamentally, we all need to reckon with the fact that the global economy, because of technological shifts, because of the power of capital, because of a number of things, has changed, you know. And so like I can tell you, just like Morocco's had big successes building an automotive and an aeronautic industry, but it doesn't employ a lot of people, because to be globally competitive these days, you need very capital intensive production, not labor intensive. So like, what do we do then? Because that leaves lots of people without a meaningful place in the economy, which leads to these systems getting strained because there's not enough resources coming into them. And I don't think anyone is really thinking about the fact, you know, Marx called them surplus populations, but they're everywhere. They're in the West, but much larger in the global South. And we got to figure out how do we create a viable society, an equitable society, in contexts where the economies themselves do not demand the labor of a huge share of the population. And that's something nobody really talks about or thinks about, certainly in this city. But it has political effects, as we might find out in a week and a half or whenever this election is. And, you know, one way or another, it's going to kick you in the teeth. So I guess that's how I.
With that,
Very positive note.
no, I would like to thank all of today's speakers. So Colin, Hassan, and especially Farah for organizing this session, and drawing all the strings in the background for making this happen. Thanks everyone for joining us, also in person or online, and I hope we can continue the conversation. And maybe just to comment on the issue that was brought up regarding conflict and wars. I think the connection between social protection and conflict is often treated in sort of the humanitarian aspect, but I think bringing that into the broader social protection discussions is actually critical, because we often see the most egregious cases around food insecurity, as well as poverty in those contexts. And universal social protection systems are one way to address them, including also during times of climate shocks. So I'm glad this was brought up in the discussion. Farah, I don't know if you would like to say anything in closing, since
Nothing.
Ari was
I just would like to thank
lead
Human Rights
organizer
Watch.
of this discussion.
No, not at all. I just wanted to thank all co-sponsors and to thank Human Rights Watch for hosting, plus and you, Lena, for moderating, and everyone who supported, yes, and everyone, and most importantly, the audience here and the other fellow panelists. So, thank you, everyone, and most importantly, the audience here and the other fellow panelists. So, most importantly, the audience.
I can't just react.